All right, I'm in the Gospel of John, chapter 12. Gospel of John, chapter 12. And in this message, I'm going to be spending a lot of time for verse 24. In verse 24, where Jesus said, "Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it produces much grain." There's a lot that I'm going to say about that's surrounding this statement that Jesus made concerning the grain of wheat. What has happened is that Jesus has entered into Jerusalem. He is now in town. This is the feast of Passover. He is required to be there in Jerusalem at this time, according to the law. And he comes into town in what's referred to as the triumphal entry, where he comes into town riding on a donkey, and that's just, that's his thing. That's his presentation on how he gets in there. Now, sorry about this, I have something in my eye. When he goes into town, what he does is he gives the religious leadership an opportunity to arrest him. That's effectively what he does. He gives the religious leadership an opportunity to arrest him because they had put out this declaration, this proclamation, hey, if anybody knows where he is, tell us where he is because we want to go get him, and so you had better tell us where he is. And I explained this in the previous message. So when he goes into town in the way that he does, he effectively says publicly, well, here I am. And he came in riding on a donkey. He did not come in with an army. He was easy to get. They could easily take him. But, we have to give these leaders, these religious guys, we got to give them some credit and acknowledge that they didn't follow through with that stupid, foolish action. All right? They didn't follow through with that. They didn't go get him. And I explained previously that it was good that they were smart enough not to go and do something like that because they would end up just releasing him. They didn't have anything to go on. It would be a public event. The people would want to see a solution to that, a reasonable one, an honest one. It just isn't going to work out. And so they were smart enough not to go get him. Jesus is there for their interests. He really is. He's looking out for them. He's coming to provide them with salvation. And they have decided, out of their foolishness, they have decided to go to be opposition to Jesus, which is absolute foolishness, because he really is genuinely looking out for their interests. And so if they win, if they win in this conflict that they're wanting to have with him, well, they're going to lose. They really are going to lose if they win. And so in this case, you got to recognize that these guys are smart enough not to follow through with what they claimed that they were going to do. And it's good to see this. It's good to understand this, that to win against Jesus is actually to lose. It really is to lose, and to lose bad. It's just going to be a matter of time before reality sets in and things unfold, and you just let that unwind, and it's just a matter of waiting and waiting long enough, and it will become completely self-evident eventually. All right, now Jesus comes into town, and obviously he's quite popular. There are a lot of people who recognize that Jesus is there. And people go after him. The religious leaders, they had proclaimed that they were accomplishing nothing because, as you can see, the whole world is going after them. Well, okay, yeah. But what did that really mean? It meant that they saw him as the king, and they were expecting him to establish the kingdom in the way that they wanted the kingdom to be established. That was what was going on. Well, he did not do what they expected him to do. And when he did not do what they expected him to do, well, then why bother hang around with him? Why bother look to him? Why bother listening to him? Why bother trying to solve the problems of life with Jesus? What's the point? And so it wasn't very long before Jesus was relatively alone. If you look at the other accounts of what happened the next day, for example, and the day after that, the people were not surrounding him and throwing their clothes down on the ground and tearing branches off the trees. They weren't doing that anymore because he wasn't doing what they expected him to do. This is significant. This is something to understand. Now, from God's point of view, from his point of view, this was a fulfillment for a lot of things. All right. First of all, when God defined the nation of Israel to begin with, he was their king. At the beginning, God was the king of the people. He gave the law, and he gave the Levitical priesthood and defined what they were to do in the event that somebody violated the law, and also to supervise the observance of the law. The Lord defined all of that when he established the nation of Israel. This was an important thing. So when he established the nation of Israel and he was the king, it worked out for a little while, but eventually what happened was that the people wanted a man to be their king, like the other nations. And that started the kingdom under Saul, and then there was the Davidic kingdom that happened after that. And we have the history of what occurred. In this circumstance, you have Jesus coming into town, and this is God manifested in the flesh. He came as a man. So they started out, the relationship began with God being the king of Israel himself personally. They rejected him because they wanted a man. All right, well, later, much later, hundreds of years later, God shows up as a man. Will they take him now? No, they would not. And so this does demonstrate that there's a lot more going on. There's a lot more happening. So let's go back to the beginning of when the nation of Israel was established and what defined it. What defined it and what established the nation of Israel to begin with was the commandments. It was the law that God gave, and this could be described as a perfect representation of the knowledge of good and evil. That's how this could be described. This is the knowledge of good and evil. And so the people can go ahead and give it their best shot. If they will do all that which is good and they will not do that which is evil, then he will bless them, and that's all described in the law. But that was the relationship, that they were to live in obedience to the commandments. And all the way up until the end of Jesus' ministry, he was telling the people, obey the commandments, obey the law of God, live in accordance with the relationship that God defined with the people. Now, there has already been a long history of the people trying and failing. Some people trying and some people failing, other people just failing because they don't even try. But there's already a long history that will demonstrate that this just isn't going to happen. It isn't going to work out. People are not going to have a successful relationship with God on this basis. That is what was established through the history of the nation of Israel. And so when Jesus is conducting his ministry, this is like the last chance, it's the last effort in order to accomplish this. During all of this time, during all of this time of the history of Israel, how would God really have felt being among the people? Well, he would definitely feel alone. Here he's got this definition of a relationship between himself and the children of Israel, and it's just not working out. It's never worked out. And so this relationship, well, it just isn't working. And so by definition, with the absence of a functional relationship, the reality is that God is alone. He really is. So Jesus is conducting his ministry, and this is the end of the Old Covenant. And while Jesus is conducting his ministry, you have God manifested in the flesh who's relating to the people in this way. God is going to be, in this sense, he's going to be alone. And Jesus is going to be living, if he's going to define things according to the absolute reality of life, Jesus is going to be alone. So when he comes into town and you have this triumphal entry, well, that may have been exciting, but the next day or shortly after that, he's going to still be alone. All right? Now, I can relate to this in my own personal life as well, because of course, before I became a believer, I was just a lost person like anybody else. And in my life that I was living before I became a believer, I was definitely living for the purpose of the indulgence of the flesh, and how can I maximize pleasure and minimize pain. If I was to define my life in some way, that's a reasonable definition, just like everybody else in the world. And I came to a point of recognizing that I was quite alone. I was alone in the sense that I didn't have quality friends in my life. I didn't have good relationships with my family, and there were a lot of good reasons why I did not. I'm not saying that there's anything strange or unusual about that. It was a reasonable reflection of the decisions that I had made and the decisions that other people had made. It was just the way things were. So I made a decision at that point. I thought, I think I need to be a better part of society. I need to be a better part of civilization. And so to do that, I think I'll become a better person. It's reasonable. And maybe if I become a better person, well, then I won't be so alone. It's a way of describing this. It's a way of understanding this. So the decision that I made was, well, I think I'll go back to the synagogue. I had some exposure to the synagogue when I was younger, in my earlier years, and I thought, this is just the thing to do. I might as well just go back to the synagogue, and that's where I'll get started. This is how I will get started to become a better person. And when I went through the experience in the synagogue, and there are several synagogues. There are different kinds, in the sense that there are those who are not that devoted to the law, and there are some that are kind of devoted to the law, and others who live their whole life just about the law. There's a big variety. But in the midst of my pursuit of wanting to become a better person, I had decided that I'm going to become a rabbi, and I aggressively studied and prepared, and I found some mentors who were willing to work with me and to help me along, and I did really well. I learned Hebrew, the language that the scriptures were written in. So I did a lot. I was very sincere and very committed and very devoted to that. But in my pursuit of this, I thought, well, in addition to everything else that I'm doing with regards to this, in addition to everything, I also need to, I need to answer the question of the Messiah. How would I know the Messiah if I saw him? Who is the Messiah? What is he supposed to do? And everybody, kind of had their own idea about what that was. But I thought, gosh, maybe God has had something to say about this. And so I went into the scriptures to read the passages related to, and God said, about the Messiah. And eventually, through my enthusiasm and through my desire to know the truth, I found enough evidence to convince myself that Jesus is the only person who could possibly qualify to be the Messiah. There just isn't anybody else who could qualify. And so I decided, okay, well, I guess Jesus is the Messiah. Now, I didn't know what that would mean or what that would imply. I was still trying to live in obedience to the Mosaic law. There didn't seem to be any reason to make any changes from my point of view. I didn't think that it was such a big deal. Of course, eventually, the people who were part of the synagogue, they felt that that was a big deal and that was just not going to work out. And the mentors that I had, they told me, hey, we're not going to give you our endorsement. We're not going to have a rabbi who's a Jew for Jesus. We're not going to do that, which is fine. That's okay. I can understand their point of view. But I made a decision at a certain point. I made a decision that I was going to believe that my sins were forgiven and that there is a relationship between God and I. There's a relationship now that has its foundation on the truth that he does not hold my sins against me anymore. Now, I didn't know where that was going to go or what that would imply, but I could get that far. I could see that. And then the time came when I couldn't hold it in anymore. I just made a public declaration. This is what I believe. All right? I believe that Jesus is the Messiah and that the sin problem between us and God was resolved by him, that he solved it. And that was a big deal. Now, I made that proclamation and I made that decision on the basis of truth, that this is the truth. All right? And it turns out that most people they don't really care about the truth. That's just not what their life is based on. They don't care about the truth. They care about other things, like force. That's what they care about. We want to know who has the power to force people to do things. I'm just giving you an example. Who has the power of the gun, to force someone to do something that we want, And so whoever they are, well, they are the people who define truth. They are the ones who tell us what truth is. And this shows itself in many different ways. But this is definitely the overwhelming majority of people in the history of humanity consider this to be the definition of truth. All right? There are other ways that you can describe this. For example, in the synagogue that I was a part of, what was the truth? It was the truth that the group believed. All right, that there was a simple definition of truth that defined the group, the synagogue. Just like any other church, a church has a certain set of doctrines, a certain set of beliefs, and they say this is the truth. We believe this, and if you want to be a member of the club, if you want to be a member of the group, then if you want to be our friends, then you have to believe this. Or at least pretend that you believe this, to some extent. Or never argue these points. Just don't argue these, And then you'll be a part of the group. And this is how people live their lives. But for me, it was there was something that was more important. I wanted to know what really is true. And so that separated me from everyone. And I discovered that I was alone again, and this is not what I signed up for. This is not what I got into. I didn't go to the synagogue. I didn't put all my time and effort into understanding this and being a part of this and being a part of the community and trying to become a better person. I didn't get into that to be alone. I did that because I didn't want to be alone. And now I find that I am alone again, but now in a different way. So there is an opportunity for a decision. I can just go back to the way I was before in the world, or no, it turned out that it was too late. I had too much exposure to God, and I thought, Jesus is the Messiah. This is real. It's real enough for me to keep going. and I'm just going to keep going. And I have never looked back since, and I never will. There's just no, I'm too far into this in the sense that I have seen too much. I understand too much. I see reality in this way to such an extent that for me to turn away from my God would be to completely deny reality. And I just don't have it in me to do that. All right. So, when it comes to the subject of truth, that really defines a lot. Jesus wanted to have a relationship with people, but he wanted this relationship to be based on the truth. Our God wanted to have a relationship with the people, but it needed to be according to the truth. When God defined a relationship with the collective, all right, with all the people of Israel, when he defined the relationship with the collective, it was on the basis of truth. And the people just never got it. They never embraced it. So while God was able to have some kind of a relationship with the people, it was always a struggle over how much truth are these people going to be willing to embrace. That would define the magnitude, the quality of the relationship that could exist at all between God and these people as a collective. But in the end, Jesus was alone. All right? In the end, God remains alone because it just isn't going to be as real as he wants. So the whole time period between the giving of the law and Jesus dying for the fulfillment of the law, because the law demanded obedience or death. Well, no one's going to obey, so how is it ever going to be fulfilled? Somebody's going to die. And the only person who's got a life worth giving is God himself, and so that's what he did. He fulfilled the law, and therefore he brought an end to the old covenant. But at the end, he was alone. All right, now for him to have a relationship with a person so that he's not going to feel alone, for him to have that, well, it's going to have to be defined on the basis of reality. And the first reality that a person needs to get in touch with is that they're never going to be right with God by what they do or what they don't do. That through their knowledge of good and evil, there will be no relationship between them and God, just because they know what's right, they know what's wrong. Maybe even if they're pretty good at doing most of what's right and not doing what's wrong, it still isn't going to cut it. All right? And this resolves a problem that goes back to another beginning, and that is the beginning of the fall of humanity, which was when Adam and Eve ate from the wrong tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. All right? Thinking that, well, if you just know what's good and evil, you can be a good person. You can be like God. That kind of quality of a person. So good. You can be so good that you can be like God. And that was the satanic lie that Adam and Eve believed that caused all these problems to begin with. So at the end of Jesus' ministry, he resolves that question. He resolves that question as well, that no, even with the perfect knowledge of good and evil and with great sincerity and pursuit of people trying to do it, it still isn't going to happen. God is going to remain alone. So God has been alone ever since he evicted Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. He has remained alone because no one has lived in reality. No one has lived in the truth. I say that in a general sense. Certainly there have been degrees of magnitude that on occasion somebody will believe something. All right, Abraham, for example, he believed God, something, at least something. So there was something that could define some relational experience between God and Abraham. There were moments like that with some people throughout history. But what Jesus did was he accomplished the task of defining this reality between God and humanity, that for there to be a relationship between God and anyone, it's going to have to be according to a different covenant entirely. And that is what the new covenant does. The new covenant defines a different relationship, one that has its foundation on the basis of truth. The truth that you are in a condition, the truth that he has provided you, he has made a provision to resolve that condition. We have sin that needs to be resolved. He resolved it through the crucifixion. In addition to that, there was another problem that had to be solved, and that was the spiritual death of humanity. When Adam and Eve violated the law of God, they died. They died spiritually because the Spirit of God, the life of God, was no longer within them. That needed to be resolved. So Jesus resolved that. He resolved that by giving the Holy Spirit to the people, making the Holy Spirit available to the people. And for those who would acknowledge their condition and acknowledge his provision, they, in effect, would be saved. They would experience salvation. And this was the salvation that he came to provide, the giving of the life of God so that they could be made spiritually alive. And once they are alive, now a living person can have a relationship with a living God. But before that, there really wasn't going to ever be a significant relationship between people and their God, because it's like it's trying to have a relationship between a living God and a dead person. There's only so far you can go with that. The people during his triumphal entry, they were calling out to Jesus, salvation now. That was Hosanna or Hoshiana. Salvation now. We want it now. Well, he was there to give them salvation. But it was a salvation that they weren't asking for. He was there to provide them with a different kind of salvation. The salvation of the giving of the Holy Spirit of God so that a person could be made spiritually alive and live eternally. That was the kind of salvation that he was offering to them. So because of what they were wanting and what he was giving, there was a difference between what they were wanting and what he was willing to give. And because of that difference, there was nothing to base a relationship on between God and the people, between Jesus and the people. You want salvation? Sure. He's got it for you. You just don't want that salvation. You want a different kind of salvation. Well, you know what? Jesus gets to decide what kind of salvation he's willing to be a part of. God gets to decide what kind of salvation he's willing to give the people. He gets to decide what kind of relationship he's willing to have with people. And if they don't want that, well, then there isn't going to be one. There just isn't, comparatively speaking. So Jesus came to provide for the forgiveness of sins, to resolve the law, to resolve the question of do we live according to the knowledge of good and evil. And he did this also so that when the Holy Spirit is restored, is given to a person who's willing to surrender to the new covenant, when that happens and a person is made spiritually alive, when that takes place, then God has provided a solution to the problem, and we now have a new relationship defined by the new covenant, and we now have a new beginning based on this truth, based on this reality that goes all the way back to creation. So what happens when a person is born again is they are made into a new creation. Now we have another creation. The way that God solves the problem of being alone, all right, because he obviously is quite alone, trying to have relationships with people who are not going to have a relationship based on truth and reality, then there will be no relationship. There is no relationship when the people are relating to each other on the basis of a false reality or on the basis of lies. Then there is no relationship. And eventually there will probably come a point where the people will just simply acknowledge, oh gosh, there really isn't a relationship because it's all a lie. So the truth is, what's real is that there isn't anything. There's nothing there. We've just been pretending. It's just been a pretend relationship. Because one person has been believing one thing and living in one way and according to one truth, and the other person to their own delusion of what their truth is. Well, eventually reality is going to set in and you're going to discover that there just isn't anything. So God solves this relational issue about him being alone by making new creations through the new covenant. And in making a new creation, what he does is he makes children of God. You are born again as a child of God. So he will be able to have a real relationship with another person on this basis, according to this covenant, based on the truth of the forgiveness of sins and the restoration of life. That's the foundation. That's the basis from which the entire relationship is defined between God and an individual. The relationship under the old covenant was one between God and the collective, and the relationship in the new covenant is between God and the individual. Because it's an individual surrender, one person at a time, who will surrender to the new covenant and say, I will embrace that. Now, the more that you have exposure to the Christian world, the more you will discover that it can be hard to find someone who really understands the magnitude of the forgiveness that they have. In most cases, people want to just keep sin alive. They want to keep sin alive. They want to keep forgiveness alive in the sense that they're constantly trying to obtain forgiveness. Constantly. All right? Depending upon how sincere or how committed they may be. Some people do it every day, keeping their short accounts with God. Other people keep long accounts with God. But whatever those are, short accounts, long accounts, they're still accounts, suggesting that the sin issue is not over. So people will usually be saved with an initial belief that the sin problem has kind of been fixed, and then they get overwhelmed with a bunch of other things that are not true about the sin issue being over, and they keep sin alive. They, by default, keep the law alive, and they go back to a life of living according to something that's similar to the old covenant, the knowledge of good and evil, and they get about as far as a Pharisee at best, is what generally happens. But in the midst of the people who surrender to the new covenant in some respects, and who may very well be saved by God, if you take that collective, that group of people, and you consider that there are very few people in that category who are willing to embrace the truth that the sin issue was resolved a long time ago, that it's over. Okay, for those few people who embrace that, well, God has someone who he can relate to and with whom he won't feel that alone with in comparison with the others. So there will be a small group within those who are probably saved, a small group who, if Jesus, or our God is spending time with this person, then God will not feel so alone with this individual, because at least they have something in common. They believe something together that's true. They are living in some aspect of what is real, something. And then you follow through and you build on that. Does this person recognize that they were once spiritually dead, but now they've been made spiritually alive? Can they see that? Can they recognize that? Moving forward from there, do they see that as a child of God, they have received an inheritance as a result of the death of Jesus on the cross? That in this abstract way, they have now been given a lot from God. Do they know what they have? Are we living our lives in accordance with what we have? Does what we have an influence in the decisions that we make, in the things that we pursue? Is it an integral part of who we are as a person? All right, these are ways of describing growth and maturity for a believer, for a Christian. And the more we move in that direction, the more we live in what is real, the more we live in what is true. And the more that we live in what is real, the more that we live in what is true, the closer we will have a connection, the more we will have a connection with our God, and the more there will be opportunities for relational experiences, which means that there will be a relationship to the degree that God will not feel so alone, and neither will you. You know, a lot of people in the Christian world who can't really get past the old covenant so much, and they can't get past the forgiveness of sins, they're not living in the inheritance, they do feel alone. They don't really feel that God is in their lives. They just don't. Most of them are too ashamed or too shy to admit it. But they do feel alone. And if you were to ask them, do you know your God? They might say yes, because they would be ashamed to say no. But if a person is willing to say no, you know, at least that's a start. At least they're living in some form of reality that they don't really know the Lord. In order to resolve that, like I said, you've got to, in many cases, go back to the beginning of the topic of salvation, start from the beginning and work through things and say, well, what really is true? What's true? And what does that imply? What is the next truth that would be implied if that's true? Where does that go? But people feel very much alone, and God is very much alone. The only way that a person will never feel alone is when they are with someone else, and there is a certain degree of truth and reality between the two. And it has to be real. You know, it has to be an official truth that is defined by God. It can't be some truth that somebody else says, I just say this is true. You know, that's not how it works. It has to be a real truth defined by God, not defined by some person who has the power to force people to do things. You know, it has to be by God. That is the only way that there will be something real, such that people will not feel alone. Which is why it's so important for people to have their individual relationship with their God, to be defined on the basis of what is true and what is real, to grow in that, because he is the definer of these things, to mature in that, so that when a person encounters someone else who is also a person who has a real relationship with the Lord, well, then they together can have a real and genuine relationship with one another. And they will not feel so alone, because they will be with each other with the common understanding of what is true and what is real that was defined by their God. But until then, people will be alone. God will be alone. Of those who God gets to have something real with, there of course will be very few. There will be very few of those who will make it that far. But you know, it is better for God to have some than to have none. And that's what makes this so wonderful, is that at least God has some with whom this is real. All right, so now having that kind of a background and having that kind of an understanding, it should give us all something to think about and something to move forward to or forward with. You know, in the sense of, well, what would I do today in order to make an improvement on my understanding of what is true and what is real? What might I do tomorrow? You know, and it can give us some direction to move in. But I'm going to go back to John chapter 12, verse 24, which is where I really want to be here. In John chapter 12, after Jesus' triumphal entry, and the people began to just go away, in a sense, because obviously Jesus is not going to provide them with the salvation they want, so that there just isn't any reason for them to hang around Jesus anymore. From their point of view, he was offering something, they just didn't want what he was offering. When he was there in Jerusalem, there were other people. All right, there were other people. There were people from other nations. There were the Gentiles. There were non-Jews who were present. And they came to Jesus, and they wanted to talk with him. They wanted to get to know him. That's described in the verses between verse 20 and 23. I'll read that. John chapter 12, verse 20, where it says, "Now there were certain Greeks among those who came up to worship at the feast. Then they said to Philip, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee, and asked him, saying, 'Sir, we wish to see Jesus.' Philip came and told Andrew, and in turn Andrew and Philip told Jesus. But Jesus answered them, saying, 'The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified. Most assuredly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone.'" All right? That's his response to the Greeks coming. Unless, he effectively says he's alone. And he feels alone, and he knows he's alone, and he knows that there's a solution to this, but this is not going to be it. The Greeks come to him to speak with him. What's he going to say? What's he going to tell them? The old covenant is still in effect. He has not yet died for the sins of the world. He's about to. It's going to happen really soon. It's going to happen this week. But, it's not happened quite yet. So there's nothing to talk about. There's nothing to say to the Greeks. There's nothing to do. Even if he was to put out some effort with these people, he's still going to be alone. And so he uses this example of the grain of wheat, and he himself is the grain of wheat. And what he's going to do is he's going to die, just as a grain of wheat would die. He's going to give up his life as he has it. He's going to give it up so that on the other side of what happens next, the new covenant will go into effect, and then a new relationship can be defined, and then there are other things that can be discussed, other things that can be worked through. There is a fulfillment of the law, a fulfillment to the question of, do we live according to the knowledge of good and evil? All right, there's a lot that has happened. There will be a solution to the spiritual death of humanity. There's a lot to talk about. There's a long ways to go about what this is going to mean and what this is going to imply. But there will be a new beginning. And Jesus says that he is alone. Folks, this is important to get in touch with. To know the truth, to believe the truth, and to live according to the truth is to be alone. All right? That's just the way it is. When Jesus dies, he is going to be alone. But with what happens next, there will be a new opportunity to have something real, to have relationships that are real, because that's what the new covenant enables. That's what makes it possible for Jesus to have real relationships. All right, to have something like that. So that's what I wanted to show you here about verse 24, and to give you all that background so that hopefully you could have a little bit of a better appreciation for what was involved in all of this, and what this would mean when Jesus said that unless the grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains alone. He is making the public proclamation that, hey guys, I'm alone. And you can see that the children of Israel, you Jews are not relating to me in the way that I would be willing to relate. So obviously I'm alone with you. So even if the Greeks show up, well, I'm still going to be alone because we need to complete the task at hand. There needs to be another covenant that would go into effect. Now, in our own lives, this can be similar. For us to have other people in our lives, in many cases, we have to let go of things that we value, of things that are important to us. The way that we use our time, we have to let some of those things go, to give up part of our lives in order to reach out to others, to interact with others. And then we make decisions about, well, just how much are we going to do that before we decide that's enough, and you move on to somebody else, and then somebody else, and somebody else, until you find people with whom you can relate to on the basis of what is true and on the basis of what is real. You find people who you can speak with and communicate with, share with them the truths that God has revealed to you, and if they believe those truths, you have the beginning of a new relationship. And just as you will die in your own life for the benefit of others, you can be also, in a small way, a grain of wheat from which many other grains of wheat will come into existence and will sprout and grow themselves. All right? So just as Jesus experiences this with us, so we also can experience this in small ways with others. All right, so that's what I've got here for John chapter 12, verse 24. For those of you who are using this in your small groups, I got a question. And try not to be too offended by this question. All right, I'm asking this question just to give you something to think about and something to consider. And it really is a question that you should ask of God, But I've got this question here. Does God feel alone when he is with you? All right? And it can be easy to feel condemned by that kind of a question. Does God feel alone when he is with you? And of course he will in some ways, right? Because we don't know. When God is with me, yeah, he's going to feel alone in some ways because there are a lot of things that I don't understand, I don't believe, I don't know. And in talking about the subject of truth, we just don't have a way to relate to one another because there's not as much truth as I would like to know than I know. And so will God feel alone with me? Will he feel alone with you? To a certain degree, yes. But the idea is that the more we grow and mature and the more we go along, in our faith, the less alone he will feel as he is with us. Okay? And this is a way of asking the question to show you that God himself, he has desires. He has interests. He does not want to feel alone. But in many cases, this is just the way things are, and he moves forward with that. He does, just fine. And he'll take whatever he can get. But it's a way of seeing that you have a God who is a person, who can feel, who knows what it's like to be alone, all right? And you can also reverse that. It's easier to look at it from the other point of view, that when you are with God, do you feel alone, And many people do. Most people certainly do feel alone when they consider the presence of God in their life, just because they don't know enough truth. They don't know him as a person well enough for that to be real within them. But whatever a person can embrace, they should embrace. And whatever you can have to move forward with, that is enough, as long as you are moving forward and continuing to pursue a knowledge and understanding of your God. All right, so that's the question I came up with. Does God feel alone when He is with you? You know, and that can be a provocative question that could be answered in a lot of different ways. But you know, it's just an open-ended question in order to facilitate discussion. All right, thank you.